The harbor was silent. Rows of cargo ships stretched across the inlet, their hulls dark against the morning water. Grey paint peeling, rust blooming along the waterlines, anchor chains slack in the tide. No smoke rose from their stacks, no voices carried across the deck, no cargo waited on the docks. These were Liberty ships, built faster than any vessels in history, launched by the hundreds to keep the lifeline open across the Atlantic. They had carried tanks, ammunition, medicine, food. They had sailed through U-boat wolf packs and winter storms. They had landed supplies on beaches, still under fire. Now the war was over, and no one knew what to do with them. In the summer of 1945, the United States Maritime Commission faced a problem. Unlike any in naval history, the nation possessed the largest merchant fleet ever assembled. More than 2,700 Liberty ships alone, thousands more Victory ships, tankers and transports, all built in less than 4 years, all designed for a war that had just ended. The shipyards that built them were already closing, the workers were going home, the convoys had stopped sailing, and the ships kept arriving. From the Pacific, from Europe, from the Mediterranean, steaming into ports along both coasts with nowhere to go, and nothing left to carry. The first instinct was simple: tie them up, preserve them, wait and see. Within months, entire fleets sat anchored in quiet rivers and protected bays: San Francisco Bay, the Hudson River, the James River in Virginia. Hundreds of ships in neat rows, swinging on their anchor chains with the current. Caretaker crews of 3 or 4 men kept the bilges pumped and the lines maintained. Nothing more. From the shore they looked like a forest of masts and funnels, an industrial graveyard stretching for miles. But these ships were not old. Most were less than 2 years from launch. Their engines were sound, their hulls still solid. They represented billions of dollars in steel and labor, built with astonishing speed during the most desperate years of the war. Selling them was not straightforward. American shipbuilders had protested even before the war ended. They argued that flooding the market with surplus tonnage would destroy the commercial shipping industry for a generation. Foreign buyers were eager. Britain needed ships, France needed ships, the Soviet Union wanted hundreds. But selling to foreign governments raised questions about rebuilding economies that had been enemies only months before. Congress debated, committees formed, investigations opened into the value of the fleet, the cost of maintenance, the risk of dumping steel on the open market. And while they debated, the ships sat. By 1946, the caretaker crews reported problems: rust spreading faster than expected, saltwater corrosion in the engine rooms, rats colonizing the holds, paint blistering in the sun. The cost of maintaining even a mothballed fleet climbed into millions of dollars each year. The Maritime Commission began to sell. Some went to American shipping companies at steep discounts, often for less than 10% of their construction cost. A ship that cost $2 million to build in 1943 sold for $150,000 in 1946. Buyers converted them: passenger liners for immigrant routes, freighters for the South American trade. One became a floating fish processing plant off Alaska. Others went overseas. Greek shipping magnates bought dozens and repainted them in Mediterranean colors. Norwegian firms acquired entire fleets. The ships that had carried Lend-Lease supplies to Murmansk were now sold to the nations they had supplied, sometimes crewed by men who had watched them arrive during the war. But hundreds remained anchored. In 1947, a sailor named Robert Chen was assigned to a caretaker detail on the James River Reserve Fleet. He later described walking the decks of Liberty ships that had not moved in 2 years. The life rafts were still in place. Tools still hung in the engine rooms. Charts still marked routes across the Atlantic. It felt, he said, like boarding a ship whose crew had simply vanished mid-voyage. The government debated again. Some officials argued for scrapping the fleet entirely. The steel could be reclaimed, the anchorages cleared. Others insisted the ships should be preserved as a strategic reserve, ready to mobilize if another war came. The Korean War settled the argument. In 1950, the United States suddenly needed cargo capacity again. Liberty ships were pulled from the reserve fleets, inspected, and reactivated. Engines that had sat cold for 5 years were restarted. Holds that had been empty were filled with military supplies bound for the Pacific. Crews were hired. Routes were planned. Not all of them made it. The SS Pendleton broke apart off Cape Cod in a winter storm in 1952, her hull split by metal fatigue after years of idleness and stress. The SS Marine Electric sank decades later, her frame weakened by age and hard use during reactivation. The Liberty ship design had never been intended for long service. They were emergency vessels, built for speed and volume, not longevity. Still, many sailed again. Through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, Liberty ships carried grain to Europe under the Marshall Plan. They moved refugees across the Mediterranean. They supplied remote islands and outposts. A ship designed for wartime convoys became a workhorse of Cold War logistics. And then, slowly, they began to disappear. By the mid-1960s, the shipping industry had changed. Containerization was transforming cargo handling. Modern diesel ships were faster and more efficient. The old steam-powered Liberty ships, even the ones kept in good repair, could not compete. The reserve fleets shrank. Ships were towed to breakers' yards in Baltimore, Texas, Taiwan. Cutting torches dismantled the hulls plate by plate. The steel was melted down and reused. Engines were salvaged. Brass fittings sold for scrap. Within weeks, a ship could be reduced to sorted piles of metal, waiting to be reforged into something new. Some escaped that end. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien remains afloat in San Francisco, maintained by volunteers as a museum. The SS John W. Brown still steams out of Baltimore on ceremonial cruises. Visitors can walk their decks, climb down into the engine rooms, see the cargo holds that once carried jeeps and artillery shells across the Atlantic. But these are exceptions. Most Liberty ships left no trace, no monuments, no plaques. By the time the last reserve fleets were decommissioned in the 1990s, only a handful remained anywhere in the world. A vessel that had once been as common as a freight train became a historical artifact. Historians had to search archives to confirm how many were built, where they sailed, what they carried. What is strange, looking back, is how quickly they were forgotten. These ships had been everywhere, photographed in every theater of war, celebrated in newsreels and propaganda posters. Sailors had lived aboard them for years. Dock workers had loaded them. Families had waited for them to arrive with letters and supplies from overseas. And then the war ended, and they became a bureaucratic problem. Steel and numbers. Assets to liquidate or preserve. Footnotes in budget hearings. The men who built them moved on to other work. The men who sailed them found new ships or left the sea entirely. The shipyards were demolished or converted to other industries. Within a generation, almost no one remembered the scale of what had been accomplished. More than 2,700 Liberty ships, built in an average of 42 days, launched from shipyards that had not existed 3 years earlier, crewed by men with weeks of training, sailed into combat zones by captains who learned navigation during the crossing. It had been an industrial miracle born of desperation. And when the desperation ended, the miracle became a surplus. There is a photograph from 1968, a reserve fleet anchorage in Suisun Bay, California. Dozens of Liberty ships are visible, rusting quietly in neat rows. The water is still, no flags are flying. In the foreground, a lone fisherman sits on the bank, his line trailing into the water between the hulls. The photograph is undated and uncredited. It exists in a maritime archive with no accompanying notes. But it captures something that official records do not. The quietness, the sense of things left behind, the way history accumulates in places no one visits, waiting to be salvaged or scrapped, or simply forgotten. The Liberty ships were built to win a war. They succeeded. And then they became relics of a world that no longer needed them, waiting in silent rivers for decisions that took decades to make. Most are gone now, melted down, sunk, or rotting in remote harbors. A few remain as museums, carefully preserved and explained to visitors who never saw them sail. But for a brief moment, they were everywhere, the backbone of the Atlantic lifeline. The reason: armies could fight thousands of miles from home. The proof that industrial capacity, pushed to its absolute limit, could change the outcome of history. And then the war ended, and the world moved on. And the ships that had carried that world to victory were left to rust, waiting for someone to decide what peace was supposed to look like.